I'm doing this from Newport, Rhode Island, which is the the location of the Naval War College, which is where most of that great generation of naval officers, admirals, who prosecuted the war in the Pacific were educated, including as lieutenants, Presidents Bush and JFK. The topic of the Second World War risks forgettability with a generation now coming into the age of high school and college students. We received a kind of a palpable lesson in that phenomenon on our commemoration of D-Day, June 6th, 1944, not long ago at the memorial. Up until the mid-roughly 90s, there was usually a small, although dwindling, cohort of participants in the battle. These were men in their middle to late 80s and 90s. But in the fullness of time, that generation has either died off or has become incapable of the logistics involved in coming to our ceremony. There was no one there who had been in the battle, D-Day. And for many people, that remains the apogee, the great moment of the Second World War. It was also the topic of a war film, a war film called Saving Private Ryan, which for authenticity and accuracy both, and for the way the screenplay was prepared and the way the history is recreated, I think is about the most powerful war film that we have ever had. And if you have a chance to show it to your classes, or perhaps many of your students have already seen it, it's not a bad evocation of what it must have been like. There's a tendency in military history to refer to battles and campaigns by the names of the famous generals. In fact, you hear people say, then Patton did so-and-so, then MacArthur conquered whatever. We are interested, perhaps more or less, in the much larger picture. How did these things happen, and how, in particular, did the United States find itself, as we say, at war as early as 1941? There's a good recent book, and I think it's a bestseller, called Angry Days, and I commend that to all of you because it's about that period of the late 30s in which the Roosevelt administration devoted itself to trying to convince the American public that this was something that we had to do. And we had to do it at that time in response to Hitler and to the great threats to those countries, particularly Britain, but also Holland and Poland and Belgium, and also, and finally, to the great threat to our own commerce and our own ability to sustain the European allies across the Atlantic. Recently, there have been a couple of good movies about that war, largely forgotten, but it's worth paying attention to. The United States was blessed, among other things, with two presidents who were extraordinarily capable at what they were called upon by their conscience and their duties to do. Two very different people serving at very different times during the war. The first of them, of course, was FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who was a wartime president, almost, you might almost say, sent from heaven, to be the leader of a democracy like ours, in whose memory the tragedies and the costs of World War I were still alive, was an audience that was reluctant and very, and needed, I might use the Roosevelt word, needed beguiling from their allegiance to the notion that this was a European thing. And incidentally, you might look at that commitment in geographical terms. What was called the Middle West in 1940 tended to be, and I say tended because it was not complete, very reluctant to be persuaded to allow such things as a military draft and such other obvious precursors of American participation. And the West, as people say, people who have never seen the Atlantic Ocean wonder why we were being called to send our sons, and it was mainly sons in those days, to fight in somebody else's war. In any case, eventually a draft was approved narrowly, and Americans began their beginning, I shouldn't say flirtation with the military, but interest in the American military, with the attraction and finally the obligation of their young men to serve. And of course, that led them into the military in ways that for most of them were very strange. Most of the big Army camps in 1940 and 1941 and thereafter were in the Deep South. And racism at that time was still an urgent preoccupation in the military. I might say also, if you'll forgive a personal intrusion, I was a company commander briefly, not in combat, in the 82nd Airborne Division. And at that time, and this is in the late 1960s, integration, a word we don't hear much anymore, was in the Army an accomplished fact, an accomplished, and I would say happy and inspiring fact. We had a company of which I would say about half were African American, the other half white. We didn't give it a thought. And the military deserves enormous credit for that in particular. The United States was blessed during the war with a cohort of extraordinarily talented leaders in the Navy and in the Army. And perhaps the most important of them, and the one who's less well remembered, was George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army from 1939 forward. And he was a rare recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize as a consequence of his work as Secretary of State and his primary authorship of what we now call the Marshall Plan. Marshall, like the other leading generals of World War II, had served in the First World War. The United States declared war on Germany early in April 1917. That was our first experience as full-blown participants in a major overseas war. And if you'll pardon the worst cliche of all, it was a terrible eye-opener for us. Military history is not aggressively and in a very, what should I say, comprehensive way taught in many of the most famous academic citadels in our country. But the time, it seems to me, to engage an audience who need to know about these things is in the time where you are the principal communicators of that education. I can hardly avoid mentioning an experience I had in Williamsburg, Virginia, about 15 or 20 years ago, watching a ceremony of initiation in the ancient Christopher Wren building into Phi Beta Kappa. And the president of the college at that time made an interesting observation. In this moment of your achievement and this wonderful honor that you have earned by hard work and applied intelligence, there are a lot of people to whom you owe thanks, perhaps more than anyone else except your families, as a great teacher in your high school at home. that's when the fire was ignited. And I think many of us can nod appreciatively at that anecdote. The Second World War, however, continuing your participation in the World War II Memorial and in the summer program, and I hope some of you will be able to come back for future summer programs, inherit something of, or participate in something of the beauty and the splendor and the sheer inspirational power of being at those ceremonies, one of which during the summertime program, when you are with us, we hope again next summer, occur at night. They're very, very moving and very beautiful. And of course, the memorial is right along Constitution Avenue. You can see the Lincoln Memorial, some of the wonderful words which remind us again of the costs of war, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all countries. But it reminds us again of the costs of war. I would enjoin also that you pay particular attention, if you can, at the towns and cities that you find yourself teaching in, and try to make linkages when you are home with people who are survivors or families who have sons, daughters, grandchildren, and so on, who participated in the Second World War, to assure that they can communicate some of its terror, its dangers, its glory, its lessons to your own communities. Harry Truman has now found a niche in the pantheon of American presidents who were extremely strong wartime leaders. And Truman, in many respects, reminds us of some of our earlier great presidents, people who made decisions with a full sense of their rectitude. We are going to do what has to be done, whether or not it pleases everybody at the time. Harry Truman himself, of course, fought in World War I. He volunteered, went over and served successfully. But as a wartime president who is not afraid to make the tough decisions, he has few equals. And of course, the important decision that he was forced to make in the summer of 1945 was the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The president who saw the country through most of the war and formed a famous friendship, a lifelong friendship with Winston Churchill was Franklin Roosevelt. And the Western Alliance, we need hardly add, was strongly, almost providentially blessed by that friendship. People don't need to be reminded, as a rule, that Churchill had a strong bias in favor of the United States. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a New Yorker. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, he was educated with a strong bias in favor of military strategy, military history, and ultimately military service. In any case, Churchill served in the First World War in the trenches, been through all of that. And then during the interwar period was a keen observer of the likelihood of further military engagement after the Depression. What else can we take from our study of the Second World War? The idea of service owed our country, the idea of doing our best not to shun that service, but to qualify it, and to look at the examples of people who paid the ultimate price, and people like some of our finest officers whose names we remember. What you learn about the Second World War, its strategy, its tactics, its technology, its devastation, its achievements, is something that you should communicate, it seems to me, with renewed vigor and determination to your students, and to encourage them to continue their study of this great conflict and the great services that your country made to its successful resolution. I envy you being high school teachers. I think it's about the greatest, most satisfying, most rewarding, most admirable career I can think of. And keep tabs on those kids, the products of your tutelage, as they leave you and go on to college. God bless all of you, and thanks for participating. And let's hope that we have seen the final end of COVID so that next summer we can see you and your successors back where you belong for those wonderful months at the World War II Memorial.
Good morning, and welcome to the 6th Annual Friends of the National World War II Memorial Teachers Conference. I was asked to speak to you today about leadership, and rather than approach the subject purely from an academic perspective, I thought it would be more interesting if I came at it obliquely, with a mixture of historical references, anecdotal stories, and personal experiences. My father was the son of immigrants and a self-made man who never talked about his achievements, which were many. He was very proud of me, and he wanted me to be a good man above all else. He became very emotional at my graduation and commissioning in the Navy, and following the ceremonies, he took me aside and gave me advice which would stay with me well beyond a successful Navy career. He simply stated, "Don't forget where you came from, and always take care of your men." Of course, today it would be men and women. Individuals in positions of power and authority have a moral obligation to treat those placed in their care with humility, magnanimity, and civility. Soon after arriving on my first ship, it became readily apparent that those individuals working under me, my subordinates, often had to perform disagreeable tasks that were invisible, except when the failure to accomplish them threatens to imperil the mission. I followed my father's advice and valued my subordinates and genuinely recognized their hard work and loyalty. I returned their loyalty and was often rewarded when they made me look good. We all desire to be treated as worthwhile human beings, and civil discourse is at the heart of those yearnings. It is also one of the most important character attributes of a genuine leader. Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant, educator, and prolific author, whose writings contributed to the philosophical and practical foundations of the modern corporation, emphasized that leadership isn't some sort of manipulation. Real leadership depends heavily on integrity, and it has extraordinary power. It alone can make the difference between success and failure in anything you do. He liked to relate the story of the great football coach Vince Lombardi, who took over the Green Bay Packers when even its very existence was uncertain. Its record the previous year was 1 win, 1 tie, and 10 losses. It was the worst year in its history. In Lombardi's first year as head coach, the Packers had 7 wins, and Lombardi was named Coach of the Year. The following year, Green Bay won the NFL Regional Championship and barely missed winning the overall NFL title by a few yards on the final play. The third year, Lombardi's Packers won the NFL Championship. These were the same players that were losers before Lombardi came aboard. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet in World War II, and the architect of victory in the Pacific, was a brilliant leader who, first of all, was a man of great integrity. Nimitz, who was personally selected for the job by President Franklin Roosevelt over the heads of many senior admirals, arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, with orders to relieve Admiral Husband Kimmel. Following a boat tour of the destruction and continuing bad news, he detected an atmosphere of defeat surrounding him and concluded that morale was sinking rapidly. He decided that he could wait no longer to assume command, and at 10:00 on the morning of December 31st, on the deck of the submarine Grayling, he took command of the Pacific Fleet. Later that day, he called a conference with the combined staffs, and it could only be described as a gloomy assemblage. He told them that he had complete and unlimited confidence in every one of them, and that he did not blame them for what had happened at Pearl Harbor. He said if there were any that wanted reassignment, he would listen to them, but insisted that certain key individuals must remain in place. Two of these individuals were Lieutenant Commander Edward Layton and Lieutenant Commander Joe Rochefort, Kimmel's intelligence officers. There was a sign of relief in the room, as Nimitz's brief comments were not what they were expecting. Almost exactly 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, we faced superior Japanese forces at the Battle of Coral Sea. The outcome could best be described as a draw. It was a tactical loss for the U.S. in terms of total damage suffered, but it resulted in the strategic success of turning back a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby on the island of Papua New Guinea. Although a tactical victory for the Japanese in terms of ships sunk, the battle would prove to be a strategic victory for the Allies for several reasons. It marked the first time since the start of the war that a major Japanese advance had been checked by the Allies. More importantly, the two Japanese carriers were damaged, and the latter, with a depleted aircraft complement, were unable to participate in the Battle of Midway the following month. What gave the U.S. forces their victory at Midway 1 month later? With superb intelligence, Nimitz had clear warning of the objectives of the Japanese forces and their timing. He knew where the Japanese carrier forces would come from and when they would most likely attack, and he was able to position the 3 American aircraft carriers to ambush the Japanese. It was an incredible victory, and Nimitz's intelligence team, led by Commander Layton and Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, gained a priceless advantage when their team deciphered the Japanese radio code. Layton convinced Nimitz that Admiral Yamamoto planned to confuse the U.S. with a diversionary attack on the Aleutians and drawing us north, only to launch his main attack on Midway Island the following day, which would see us hurrying south into an ambush. With the Japanese fleet widely dispersed, Yamamoto was forced to transmit his strategy by radio, and thus Layton and Rochefort were able to recover about 90% of the plan. With the information they had, it was not hard to confirm that the target was Midway. What would have been the outcome of this decisive battle if Nimitz had fired these outstanding intelligence officers in a house cleaning when he took command of the Pacific Fleet? What success would Vince Lombardi have had if he rid the Packers of the team of so-called losers? Drucker, author of many books and articles on leadership, wrote that leadership has incredible power. It all depends on a single decision: your decision to be a leader. Leadership is getting things accomplished by acting through others. Regardless of your own abilities, there are many important goals that you cannot attain without the help of others. A newsman by the name of Napoleon Hill interviewed steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was one of the wealthiest men alive. He convinced Hill to devote 20 years of his life to a study of what made men successful. Carnegie helped Hill by giving him introductions to the mightiest, wealthiest, and best-known men of his day. These included Henry Ford, Theodore Roosevelt, George Eastman, John D. Rockefeller, Thomas Edison, Julius Rosenwald, Clarence Darrow, and many others. He discovered an amazing fact from his research, which Dr. Drucker later confirmed by his own observations and analysis. No successful individual became successful strictly by his own actions. Every single one of the successful individuals that Napoleon Hill had interviewed had become successful through the help of others. These other individuals had a greater talent in some area. Who were these others? They were bosses, colleagues, and subordinates. Without them, not a single person that Hill had interviewed had become successful. Carnegie must have recognized this because on his tombstone, he had engraved a single sentence. Here lies one who knew how to get around him men who were cleverer than himself. Leadership is not management. Management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. And it doesn't make any difference whether you are leading a company, an organization, a military unit, or some friends in a club. But it has little to do with management. Leadership is the art of influencing others to their maximum performance to accomplish any task, objective, or project. Drucker defined leadership as the lifting of a man's vision to higher heights, the raising of a man's performance to a higher standard, the building of a man's personality beyond its normal limitations. Drucker's definition supports my long-held belief in the philosophy of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. If you treat an individual as he is, he will remain as he is. But if you treat him as if he were what he ought to be and could be, he will become what he ought to be and could be. Drucker concluded that one of the 5 most important aspects of leadership is that most people become successful only through the help of others. Leadership experts in business and academia have discussed and debated the tenets, values, and character of great leaders throughout history, and agree that the best among them possess a handful of values and qualities that are imperative to outstanding leadership. I place character and integrity at the head of the list that includes the ability to accept criticism, taking care of your people, empathy, civility, humility, and always doing the right thing. Leaders who are able to accept criticism surround themselves with honest brokers who give candid feedback they listen to and thus make better decisions and are better leaders than the ones who do not. Organizational psychologist and Wharton professor Adam Grant stated that one of the things that immediately comes to mind when he thinks of a good leader is caring about employees. I hearken back to my father's sage advice to me many years ago when he said, always take care of your men. Real leaders actually care about their people and put their people first. Historian and author Doris Kearns Goodwin discusses empathy in her latest book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, and how Presidents Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin D. Roosevelt all had it and needed it to face the significant challenges they all faced during their respective presidencies. She writes that Lincoln and Johnson were born with it because they grew up poor. But the Roosevelts had to acquire it in adulthood as they form friendships outside their social class and learn it through their life's experiences. In my first year at the academy, the superintendent would occasionally meet with a small group of first-year midshipmen and take questions and provide guidance and often tell an anecdotal story with a moral. One story I have remembered all these years was about a large Navy ship traveling across the North Atlantic just prior to our entry into World War II. A young sailor in his first time at sea was walking across the main deck at night when he heard what he believed were cries for help off the starboard side of the ship. He looked in the direction the cries were coming from, but was unable to observe anyone in the water. The cries for help, which actually were strong, continued but gradually diminished in volume and became more difficult to hear. The sailor remembered his training and ran up to the ship's bridge and reported what he had heard. The officer of the deck immediately sounded, man overboard, starboard side," and commenced the Williamson turn, where you put the rudder hard over in the direction of the man overboard, which kicks the stern away from and prevents possible contact with the ship's propellers. The rudder is then shifted in the opposite direction, and at a predetermined point, the ship is slowed, and if done correctly, it will bring you back to the last known position of the man in the water. I have done it more times than I can count, and it is incredibly accurate. By the time the captain was on a bridge and a boat was lowered in the water, and the search began in earnest, after about an hour of searching, the captain called the sailor to the bridge and quietly told him that he did the right thing in reporting what he believed he heard. However, due to the sound of the wind passing through the mast and the superstructure, combined with the sea lapping against the side of the ship and the ambient noise of the ship's engines and auxiliary machinery, we sometimes hear things that do not exist. The sailor in his late teens looked up at this distinguished-looking gray-haired gentleman with 4 gold stripes on his sleeve and said, "Captain, I distinctly heard someone calling for help, and I heard it at least 5 times." The captain ordered the boat to continue searching for another hour. They were about to complete the search. They located a man in the water holding on to floating wreckage. He was the sole survivor of a Norwegian ship that had been sunk earlier in the day, and he had been in the water for hours and could not have lasted much longer. He revealed that he was about to give up when he saw the lights of a ship coming toward him, and what appeared to be a man on deck looking in his direction. He began calling for help and was buoyed when the ship turned in his direction. When the Admiral finished the story, he looked at us and said, "If you believe you are right, always stick to your guns." The 2 central figures in this story exemplified character in the strongest sense of the word. In addition, the captain exhibited empathy, kindness, and understanding, and the young sailor was a pillar of strength and steadfastness. These are all tenets of leadership in the larger sense of the word. In the chapter on Theodore Roosevelt in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on leadership, she talks about how Roosevelt was later asked how he was able to successfully lead such disparate departments as the Civil Service Commission, the New York Police Department, and the Navy Department. He insisted that the challenges he faced did not necessitate genius or even any unusual qualities, but just common sense, common honesty, energy, resolution, and readiness to learn. Goodwin is convinced Roosevelt's leadership style was governed by such simple dictums and aphorisms: hit the ground running, consolidate control, ask questions of everyone wherever you go, manage by walking around, determine the basic problems of each organization, and hit them head on. When attacked, counterattack. Stick to your guns. Spend your political capital to reach your goals, and when your work is stymied or done, find a way out. I would like to close using a vignette involving General George S. Patton, probably the most effective combat general in World War II. If you have the intellectual energy to expand your understanding of Patton beyond George C. Scott's portrayal of him in the 1970 movie that bears his name, I recommend that you read Carlo D'Este's A Genius for War, a detailed study of Patton and the relationship he established with his staff in particular reveals such a leader. Patton is a study of command. He represents a model for professional development. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general and military theorist, who stressed the moral or psychological and political aspects of war, invites his readers to ruminate with him on the complex nature of war. Patton also invited his subordinates to ruminate with him, to challenge him. The ability to conceptually define and develop tangible solutions to multiple domain operational problems requires provocative debate, not parochialism and sycophancy. A leader, therefore, must possess not only an inquiring mind, he has to create an environment that promotes it in his subordinates. In late 1944, as the German Wehrmacht prepared to launch its last counteroffensive at the Battle of the Bulge, several pieces of intelligence suggested it was coming. The top Allied generals couldn't agree on the value of the intelligence. British Field Marshal Montgomery and his obedient intelligence officer, known as his G2, stubbornly rejected the facts. General Omar Bradley and his G2 remained skeptical and passive. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and his G2 were somewhat quicker to sense the danger, but slower than Patton, whose G2 saw it coming several weeks beforehand, prompting Patton to get his divisions ready to meet the offensive. So 4 commanders with essentially the same intelligence turned in different performances. Though slightly disadvantaged by being in a lower echelon than all the others, Patton was far ahead of them in his appreciation of the impending assault. In writing up this case study, Harold Deutsch, a military historian in World War II, showed how the personalities of these commanders intimidated their G2s, discouraging them from emphasizing unpleasant findings or pursuing other lines of analysis. In his words, whether the commanding general was on the correct or wrong track, therefore the G2 was likely to be right there with him. Perhaps the fine performance of Colonel Gustav Koch, Patton's G2, was largely due to being lucky in his boss. General Omar Bradley and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery fired 43 subordinate commanders in World War II. Patton fired only 1. Technically, he did not fire a particular general, but rather had him reassigned to a position more suitable to his talents, and it did not hurt his career. In another instance, a newly assigned brigadier general asked for a meeting with Patton and told him he did not think he was up to the job. Patton told him to get his things together, and they drove up to the front. Upon reaching their destination, they got out of the vehicle, and Patton told the young general he had complete confidence and trust in him to successfully carry out his duties, and drove off. The officer's performance on the fire proved Patton was correct in his assessment. One can only surmise he realized the implications, even if done for the right reasons, on the willingness of subordinates to take the initiative. Patton also gave his 2 chiefs of staff, Hobart Gay and Hugh Gaffney, the authority to issue orders in his name throughout the entire war. If a leader wants to create an environment that causes subordinates to challenge conventional wisdom and take the initiative, he must create one that allows for some degree of failure. To quote my Army general son-in-law, at the end of the day, leadership is a contact sport, and it does not work if you redshirt the quarterback, or in non-football jargon, when those in leadership positions do not allow an atmosphere where they can be seriously challenged with alternative views. It is a pleasure to share my remarks about leadership with you today, and I only wish I could be with you in person and ruminate with you on this important subject. And I remember with great affection and appreciation the teachers in my life who guided and encouraged me at all levels of my schooling. Not only did they open my mind to the greater world, they reinforced my moral compass. Best wishes for an interesting and successful conference. Thank you.